You pick up your phone right now out of habit before you even decide to. You do not remember choosing to do it. Your thumb just knows the motion. Now imagine tomorrow morning, every app that motion opens is simply gone. Not banned, not down for maintenance. Gone. Permanently. Everywhere, all at once. What would actually happen to you in the first hour? The answer is not what you think, and it starts inside your own skull, not on a server somewhere. You feel it before you understand it. A strange itch in your hand, a phantom vibration that never happened. You check the empty space where the app used to be, and for a moment your brain genuinely does not know what to do with itself. That gap, that few seconds of not knowing, is not weakness. It is a very specific, very well understood mechanism, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In the 1950s, the psychologist B.F. Skinner ran a series of experiments on pigeons and levers. He noticed something strange. Pigeons that got a food pellet every single time they pressed a lever eventually stopped pressing it as often. But pigeons that got a pellet only sometimes on an unpredictable schedule pressed the lever obsessively, even long after the food stopped coming entirely. He called it a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. You know this pattern intimately, even if you have never heard the name for it. It is the exact mechanism behind a slot machine, and it is the exact mechanism behind a notification you cannot predict. Every time you unlock your phone, some part of your brain is running the same unconscious bet a pigeon runs on a liver. Maybe there is something good waiting. Maybe there is nothing. You do not know until you check. That uncertainty is not an accident of app design. It is the entire design. So picture that mechanism vanishing overnight. What happens to a brain that has been playing an unpredictable reward game for years when the machine is suddenly unplugged? For the first few days, you would likely feel something close to withdrawal. Not the dramatic kind you see in films. A quieter kind. Restlessness. A vague sense that something is missing, even in moments when nothing was ever actually happening on the screen. Researchers who study behavioral addiction describe this as an extinction burst, a short period where the old behavior actually intensifies before it fades, because your brain keeps checking for a reward that no longer exists. You would likely reach for your phone more in the first 3 days, not less. But here's the part almost nobody expects. That phase would not last. Human brains are remarkably good at one thing above almost everything else. They adapt to whatever environment they are actually in, not the one they remember. Within 1 to 2 weeks, most of that restless reaching would fade, simply because the behavior stops being reinforced. This has already been tested in small ways more than once. In October 2021, several major social platforms went offline simultaneously for about 6 hours due to a technical failure. For that short window, billions of people worldwide had no access to their feeds at all. Researchers and journalists tracking public sentiment during the outage found a strange mixture of reactions: confusion, jokes, a brief spike in phone calls and text messages as people fell back on older channels to reach each other, and underneath it, something quieter. A flicker of relief in some corners of the internet, people openly admitting they had gotten more done in those 6 hours than they had in days. 6 hours is not 30 days, but it is a hint, a small temporary preview of a much larger question. What happens when the 6 hours never end? You might assume the biggest change would be less distraction, more free time. And yes, that part is real. Studies on time use consistently find that heavy social media users spend several hours a day on these platforms. Time that would not simply vanish, it would have to go somewhere. Some of it would likely flow into other forms of entertainment: streaming, gaming, books, for a smaller portion of people. But a meaningful chunk of that reclaimed time would land somewhere far less comfortable. Boredom. Real, unfilled, undistracted boredom is something an entire generation has almost never experienced for more than a few seconds at a time. The moment a line gets long, or a bus is late, or a meeting runs slow, the reflex has been to fill the gap instantly. Remove that option completely, and something interesting happens to the mind. Boredom, it turns out, is not empty. It is where a huge amount of your creative thinking actually happens. Psychologists studying idle attention have found that when the brain is not absorbed in an external task, it activates what is called the default mode network, a set of brain regions responsible for daydreaming, self-reflection, and, notably, original ideas. Some of the most creative insights people report having in the shower, on a walk, staring out a train window, happen precisely because nothing else is competing for attention. A world without social media might accidentally become a world with a strange, unplanned surge in idle daydreaming, and with it, a surge in the kind of thinking that only shows up when you are not being fed a constant stream of somebody else's thoughts. Now widen the lens, because the personal habit loop is only the smallest part of this story. Social media did not just change what individuals do with their hands, it changed how entire societies find each other. The sociologist Mark Granovetter published a paper decades ago that became one of the most cited works in social science. It was called The Strength of Weak Ties. His finding was almost counterintuitive. When people look for jobs or opportunities or new information, the people who help them most are usually not their closest friends. They are acquaintances, loose connections, people they know just well enough to ask a favor from, but not well enough to see every week. Weak ties, Granovetter argued, are actually stronger for spreading new information than strong ties, because your close friends already know what you know. Your loose acquaintances know something different. Social media is, at its core, an enormous machine for maintaining thousands of weak ties at almost no cost. A person you met once at a conference 5 years ago, a former coworker, a friend of a friend. Before social media, maintaining that connection required effort, a phone call, a letter, a chance encounter. Social media made it free and automatic. You did not have to do anything to stay loosely connected. The platform did it for you quietly in the background every time you saw their name pop up. Remove that machine overnight and you do not just lose entertainment. You lose an entire invisible network of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of weak ties per person all at once. Some of them would fade within weeks, simply because there is no longer an easy channel keeping them alive. Others would migrate to older tools. You would likely see a real resurgence in phone calls, in group texts, in email newsletters, in the humble act of writing something down and mailing it, because human beings do not stop wanting connection just because the easiest tool for it disappeared. They find a new tool. They always have. But some of those weak ties simply would not survive the transition. And that has consequences nobody would notice immediately, because weak ties do their work quietly in the background, often years before you ever need them. The job that comes through a distant acquaintance. The apartment lead from a friend of a friend. The chance meeting turned collaboration. A world without social media would likely be a world with a slower, quieter version of those connections. Not gone, just harder to reach. Which sounds small until you realize how much of the modern world quietly depends on those small, hard-to-reach threads. Here is where the story takes its sharpest turn. You might expect that removing social media would obviously make people happier, calmer, healthier. Some research does support pieces of that. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has argued, using data from multiple countries, that the sharp rise in anxiety and depression among teenagers, beginning around the early 2000s, tracks closely with the mass adoption of smartphones and social platforms among that age group. The psychologist Twenge, studying a generation she calls iGen, found similar patterns: teenagers reporting less in-person socializing, less sleep, and more loneliness in years that lined up almost exactly with the platforms becoming a constant presence in daily life. So the intuitive prediction seems obvious. Remove the platforms and you would expect those numbers to reverse. Less anxiety, more sleep, more real conversation. And for a portion of the population, especially teenagers, that prediction would likely hold true, at least partially. Sleep researchers have long pointed out that screens before bed disrupt the body's release of melatonin. The hormone that signals it is time to rest. Remove the primary reason people stare at a glowing screen at midnight, and you would likely see measurable improvements in how long and how well a huge number of people actually sleep. But here is the twist almost nobody predicts. For another significant portion of the population, the effect would run in the opposite direction, at least at first, because for many people, especially those who are isolated for reasons outside their control, disability, chronic illness, living far from family, belonging to a minority community with few people nearby who share their experience, social media is not a distraction from real connection. It is the only reliable connection they have. The psychologist Turkle has spent decades studying how people relate to technology, and one of her central warnings is that these platforms often give people the feeling of connection without its substance, what she calls being alone together. But her research also acknowledges the other side of that same coin. For someone in a small town who is the only person they know who shares their specific experience, whether that is a rare medical condition, a niche interest, or an identity that is not accepted by the people physically around them, an online community is not a shallow substitute. It is sometimes the first and only place they have ever felt understood. Remove social media overnight, and you do not just remove a distraction for the majority, you also remove a lifeline for a minority who had built their entire support system on top of it. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every optimistic headline about a healthier, quieter world. The same tool that fragmented attention for billions also stitched together belonging for millions who had nowhere else to find it. Do you see the pattern forming? Every simple story about this technology hides a second, opposite story running underneath it. Widen the lens again, because individuals and small communities are still not the whole picture. Entire economies would shudder. An enormous, largely invisible industry exists entirely inside these platforms. Small business owners who sell exclusively through a shop built into a social app. Independent creators whose entire income comes from short videos and the advertising revenue attached to them. Local restaurants and boutiques that rely on a single post reaching the right few hundred people at the right moment. Remove the platforms overnight and you remove instantly without warning, the primary sales channel for millions of small operations worldwide. Some would survive by rebuilding on independent websites, email lists, and word of mouth, the way businesses did for the entire history of commerce before this technology existed. Many would not survive the transition fast enough. The economic shock would not be evenly distributed. It would land hardest on exactly the people who had the least cushion to absorb it. At the same time, something else would happen at a much larger scale, one most people rarely think about at all. Political organizing, protest movements, and rapid public accountability have leaned on these platforms for over a decade. Information that once took newspapers days to verify and publish can now spread in minutes, for better and for worse. Remove that mechanism, and the speed at which ordinary people can organize or expose wrongdoing or coordinate around a shared cause would slow considerably. Some researchers who study social movements argue this speed has been a double-edged sword all along, allowing both important accountability and dangerous misinformation to spread at the same velocity. A world without these platforms would likely see slower movements, but also possibly less panic, less rumor, less instant outrage aimed at the wrong target before all the facts exist. Slower is not automatically worse. It is simply different, and it would force something modern life has almost forgotten how to do. Wait before reacting. Now bring it back down to the smallest scale again, because the most human part of this story is still waiting. Remember the anthropologist Robin Dunbar and his finding that the human brain can only meaningfully track around 150 relationships. Social media never actually broke that number, just gave you the illusion of tracking thousands. You were never truly connected to 4,000 followers. You were connected to a feed, a performance, a curated slice of 150 people at most, surrounded by the noise of thousands more you would never actually know. Remove the platforms, and that illusion collapses instantly. What is left underneath it is what was always actually there, the real 150. The people you would call, the people who would show up, the people your brain was built to hold on to in the first place. For many people, that collapse would feel like loss at first because the illusion of a large audience is intoxicating, even when it is mostly hollow. But for the actual relationships that matter, the ones built on more than a like or a passing comment, very little would truly change. You would simply be forced to reach them through a phone call instead of a scroll. And there is something almost old-fashioned, almost restorative, about a phone ringing instead of a notification buzzing. Here is the sentence that should genuinely surprise you. The platforms did not create human connection, and they cannot actually destroy it either. They only changed its packaging. The need underneath to be known, to be missed, to matter to at least a few specific people existed long before a single line of code was written for any of these apps, and it would still be sitting there, fully intact, the moment they vanished. Think about what that means for the modern moment you feel restless without your phone in your hand. That restlessness is not really about the app. It is a very old, very human discomfort with silence, dressed up in a new costume. Human beings have always struggled with unfilled moments. Before phones, people fidgeted with cigarettes, worry beads, newspapers folded and refolded, anything to avoid sitting with nothing at all happening in the mind. The specific object in your hand keeps changing, decade after decade. The underlying discomfort it is soothing has stayed remarkably constant. So if every platform disappeared tomorrow, the first week would be strange, restless, a little disorienting, in the exact way any habit feels disorienting when it is suddenly removed. The second and third week would likely bring a genuine, measurable rise in boredom, in daydreaming, in phone calls, in slower but perhaps more resilient economic and political systems rebuilding themselves the long way. Somewhere in there, a meaningful number of isolated people would lose the only community that had ever made them feel less alone, and that loss would be real, and it would matter, and it should not be waved away by anyone celebrating a quieter world. And somewhere further down the line, something quieter than either the panic or the relief would settle in. Life would go on because it always has. Humans built rich, complicated, connected societies for the entire span of history before any of this existed, and the wiring that made that possible never actually left you. It was only ever borrowed for a while, repackaged, sped up, and handed back to you wrapped in a glowing rectangle. You pick up your phone right now, out of habit, before you even decide to. Your thumb still knows the motion, but underneath that motion is something far older than any app, something that was never really about the platform at all. It was always about wanting to be known by the specific, small handful of people who actually know you back. Take the platform away, and that want does not disappear with it. It simply goes looking for you again, the way it always has, in whatever form is left standing.